We're looking at the theme of inconvenient truth. And today what I'd like us to address is the question of obedience. In 1 Peter chapter 1, 1 and 2, Peter says, an apostle of Jesus Christ to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father by the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in fullest measure. So it wasn't just Peter who's saying this emphasis on obedience right at the beginning of the letter, because when you turn to Romans chapter 1, and this time it's the Apostle Paul, we start off the letter, the first 5 verses, he says, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David, according to the flesh. He was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake. So the Bible is very clear. The confession Jesus is Lord is not just a descriptor. But one of my contentions for this series of talks is that in the modern world, many foundational basic truths given in the Bible, they're either ignored, they're avoided, or they're rejected because they're too impractical, they're too demanding, or we feel it's perhaps just inconvenient. I don't want to do those things. We live in a culture that is adapting all the time around themes like, as I said, convenience and just that which fits my desires. A number of years ago, actually just after the Second World War, I think it was, Christopher Dawson, a historian, and you'll hear this by a little bit by the language, he said, but he was talking about the church and the changing culture in Britain at that time. He says, we have entered on a new phase of culture. We may call it the age of the cinema, in which the most amazing perfection of scientific technique is being devoted to purely ephemeral objects without any consideration of their ultimate justification. It seems as though a new society was arising which will acknowledge no hierarchy of values, no intellectual authority, and no social or religious tradition, but which will live for the moment in a chaos of pure sensation. I read those words at this time in history and I think, my goodness, how descriptive that is of our time, living in a chaos of pure sensation. We're feeling good and looking good and just enjoying life to the max is the number one desire of many hearts. So this idea of obedience, what is the definition? Well, the key notion of obedience means to listen or attend, to submit. In the biblical context, it's tied to faith and trust as an expression of that. In fact, we read this from the Vine's dictionary. It said, faith is of the heart, invisible to men. Obedience is of the conduct and may be observed. When a man obeys God, he gives the only possible evidence that in his heart he believes in God. So I like that. Faith is of the heart, it's invisible, but obedience is of the conduct, it is visible. So we know someone by someone's beliefs, their values, by what they do or by what they don't do. That's an evidential trail in our life. But here we are as modern people, modern men, modern young women. And Peter Berger, the sociologist, describes this about looking at the cultural moment that we live in. He says the autonomous individual is the strategically central component of modern Western world. It animates modern jurisprudence, modern liberal democracy, the market economy, modern higher education, and other primary institutional features of modern society. And he says there are 6 propositions that come out about this individualism as it shapes society. He says this, number 1, the uniqueness of the individual represents his or her essential reality. Second, individuals are or ought to be free. Thirdly, individuals are to be held responsible for their own actions. Fourthly, an individual's subjective experience of the world is real by definition. Remember, these are beliefs he's saying that are now a shaping part of the narrative of our culture. Fifthly, individuals possess certain rights over against all other collectivities. And 6, individuals are ultimately responsible for creating themselves. Back many years ago, Walt Whitman, of course, many teenagers in school in America will have read his famous words where he says, I sing the song of myself, as if that's something new. We've been singing the song of ourselves for a long time. When you go back to the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, you get a couple of very interesting cameo pictures. One in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, where you have this encounter between our early humanity and this creature, this being that we know as the Satan. And he says, basically, he throws doubt on God's word. In Genesis 3, verse 1, has God said? Can we trust God? Is there a God? Should we believe him? So we reject that word. But when we fast forward a little bit into the narrative, in Genesis chapter 11, we find that people have scattered around the world. They're beginning to populate. They're building cities. And in Genesis 11 and verse 4, we see that they gather together. And what does combined humanity do? They want to solve the questions of security and power. So they say, let's build a tower that goes all the way up to God and let us make a name for ourselves. So those two things in Genesis 11 are very clear. They want to build a tower because they want the security. They want to come from the ground up to God. They'll worship on their own terms. They want to make a name for their own significance. But the very next chapter, Genesis chapter 12 in verses 1 through 3, is the story of Abraham when he gets his call. And God tells him to go forth, to leave his people. And God tells him, I will make a name for you. So right at that early part of Genesis, we have two trajectories of human history. Human beings taking their rational power, control their own destiny, managing life, building the future as they understand it. And in Genesis 12, a man called to live by faith. In other words, to trust that God is real, true, and safe, and to put his life on the line. And that's what Abraham does. And those are our choices. That's our choices today in the church or outside of it. Will I submit to God and follow him, his will, his way, his word, and trust him? Or do I want a self-defined life and just make it up on my own terms? Does God really exist? Has he spoken really and truthfully? If he has spoken, then obedience is central to what Christian living requires. John Calvin said this, true knowledge of God is born out of obedience. So a few New Testament passages are clear to us, and we can see how often Jesus said that. I mean, there are many I could refer to, but I think I quoted it before in one of the earlier talks. But Matthew chapter 7 is so clear because it's at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has just taught very specifically, and in the climax he says this in 24 through 27. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against the house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine, does not act on them, will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So Jesus makes it very, very clear that obedience is central if indeed who he is. If he is God in the flesh, if he is the Lord of history, then it's not an optional extra that we obey him. It's a sign that we truly trust him and follow him. In John chapter 14 and verses 15 through 23, we read here, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And I'll ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, and he will be with you forever. That is the Spirit of truth whom the world cannot receive, because it does not see him or know him. But you know him, because he abides with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as the orphans. I will come to you. After a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live, you will live also. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. He who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will disclose myself to him. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, what then has happened that you're going to disclose yourself to us and not to the world? Jesus answered and said, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him. We will come to him and make our abode with him. So this is the central fact, that at any measurement we look at this, obedience is central. When you roll forward into the New Testament, in 1 John chapter 2, we find that that's a repeated part of John's emphasis. Many questions were coming in the early churches. How do we know someone really knows God? What would the characteristics? What should we look for? And John writes this very, very clearly, time and time again. You see these words in 1 John, by this we know. So here is 1 John chapter 2 and verses 3 through 5. By this we know we've come to know him if we keep his commandments. The one who says, I've come to know him, does not keep his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Whoever keeps his word, in him the love of God has truly been perfected. By this we know that we are in him. So this was very, very clear. The church is facing persecution, the church is facing pressure, but obedience is central because it's an evidence of love, that I have really come to know him existentially, truly, intellectually. I have given my life, I am following him, and I'm willing to walk with him no matter what it costs. He makes this very clear in 1 John 5. Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. Whoever loves the Father loves the child born of him. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and observe his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. His commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is the one who overcomes the world? But he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. So if God had acted, if Christ has come, if there was a resurrection, if he had spoken, it demands a response. But just how free are we? What is this about our avoidance issues? Matthew suggests time and time again that Jesus is questioned on his authority. Many people hear him coming and proclaiming to be the Messiah, and who gave him this authority? How can he ask these things? Well, if he is, and that's the question, if he is who he says he is to be obeyed. But of course they wrestled with that. And it's the resurrection that vindicates that Jesus was in fact the truth. But there's a passage I'd just like to talk about very briefly here in Matthew 21. And it's, I think, very indicative of what goes on in real life. And the way that we respond to truth, or we basically say, well, I don't really know what's involved, or I don't know what... We always try to make the obedience more complex or make it more difficult. We didn't understand. We didn't evolve the facts. Or if only I had known this. Here in Matthew 21, 28 through 32, Jesus tells a parable. He says, what do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he came to the first and he said, go work today in the vineyard. And he answered, I will not. But after he regretted it and went. This is the first son. The man came to the second son and he said the same thing. And he answered, said, I will, sir, but he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of the Father? They said, the first. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the tax collectors, the prostitutes will get into the kingdom of heaven before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors, the prostitutes, did believe him. And you, seeing this, did not even feel remorse afterwards so as to believe him. To me, this is the challenge that many times I see in life, and we see in churches, and we see in individual life. People who say, I will. What is important in many of our lives is the illusion of obedience, which is submerged often in the feeling of sincerity. I don't actually do the truth. I say that I wanted to or I was willing, but I never, so actual obedience never comes. The feeling of obedience, the feeling of sincerity replaces the act or the action of actually doing what God says. Leslie Newbigin is helpful when we think about the human condition here. He says, the world is not as free as it thinks it is. We are not honest inquirers seeking out the truth. We're alienated from the truth. We're enemies of it. We are by nature idolaters, constructing images of truth shaped by our own desires. Now, if I think that that's horrible words, or I don't believe that, or I don't accept my condition, I trust myself unreservedly. I trust my feelings and judgment. I follow Disney in this idea of just trust yourself, believe in yourself. I can believe that many of my intuitions are good, but not all of them. I know that if I was to do things all the time my own way, that I lie to myself. We all do that. Because we want life on our own terms. We want life the way we want it. And we're not willing to sacrifice. And at the heart of this is the willing to learn to die to self, to take up our cross. Maybe my own reason, what I consider as the intellectual inadequacy. So I don't believe, because I'm still trying to rationally figure out this Christianity thing. So I'll obey if I can just understand it. Might be my social standing. But if I obeyed those things that Jesus said, if I lived that way, my friends would laugh. People would kick me out of the sorority. I would be considered a mockery. And so basically on social pressure, I choose disobedience. Or maybe it's my passions. I don't want to give up my sexual appetites in that way. I don't want to give up my indulgence. I don't want to bow the knee. I just want to do what I want. And so I'm not willing to surrender. Obedience to self alone is the world's ruling principle. Shakespeare many years ago famously said in one of his writings, above all, to thyself be true. And going back to Immanuel Kant in the time of the Enlightenment, the modern era opened up with this ideal of sapere aude, know yourself. And for many people, that's their greatest project. It's not to know more about life, it's about themselves. They find themselves and their longings and their emotions and their psychology and their history and their pains and whatever is the greatest project of life. And we become self-obsessed. We're like little narcissists all sitting around gazing at our navel, rather than engaging in life, looking outward, giving love and service and mission. Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself, who saw this capitulation of the church, who basically allowed some of these kind of things into the church, and even the way that the Nazi rulership, Nazi power agendas, Aryanism, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism was taking place in churches that should have known better, that they came from the Jewish people, they were children of the covenant, began to change and alter this message. Why? Because they wanted something else. And Bonhoeffer took this back to the feet of cheap grace. What is this cheap grace thing? He said, cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. And I think he's absolutely right. We come up with something that fits the modern world, their appetites, and we can do this time and time again. We can do this in American culture. We can do this wherever we're living when we adapt and water down and dilute, and the raw words of Jesus or the raw words of the epistles are totally ignored, avoided. Don't even pay any attention to them, as if they don't matter, because our own will is supreme. In Germany, that led to the rise of the Nazis as part of the agenda. There were other reasons involved. It wasn't just the church, obviously. Many leaders taught, though, this essence of Christian was just this grace faith. So it was an easy believism, a costless, crossless Christianity. And modern examples are not hard to find today. What is costly grace? Well, remember, this comes from a man who not only wrote manuals, went back to Germany in the face of the Nazis. After having come out to study in America, he could have stayed here. He went back knowing full well that that might lead to problems, and it did, to his arrest and his execution eventually in 1945 by the Nazis. But in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, this is what he said. Costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price, to buy which the merchant will sell all of his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for which sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ, at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. And so the challenge to us today, in our modern convenience-driven culture and society, which voice, which authority do we recognize? It's not just like work ourselves up by our bootstrap or out of our enthusiasm or maybe by willing ourselves. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is that we seek the face of Christ, that we study the Gospels more clearly, and that we listen for the words of command which are abundant in the Scriptures, and that we take them seriously. And we start to apply them more readily in our churches and in our lives. But to do so, that means we need to understand the human heart. Why don't we do what we know we should do? Is it easy to believe? Is it easy to follow? Well, the Bible makes it clear. Our problems aren't merely intellectual. In Matthew chapter 7, there's a very great description of the essence of where the problem lies in our life. In Matthew 7:14 through 23, Jesus says, he called the crowds to him, and he says, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. When he had said this, the crowd, when he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples questioned him about the parable. And he said to them, are you so lacking in understanding? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not go into his heart, but it's in his stomach, and it's eliminated. Thus he declared all foods clean. He was saying that which proceeds out of the man, that's what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All of these things proceed from within and defile the man. You see, the strategies of denial is that modern men and women think we are good. We think we are born essentially like sweet little babies, and we grow up to be wonderful people, and then we grow up to be great adults, and we all live happily ever after in Disneyland. But I don't think so. I mean, just listen to the news on any given day from any part of our city. Listen to the news from around the world. Can you really have an idea of optimistic vision of humanism? It's not that we're all bad. I'm not saying that we're all bad, but I'm saying we're certainly not all good. We're some kind of mixture. And the strategies of denial that we employ to not do the truth are manifold. Evasion, misdirection. In a book called Suspicion and Faith, written by Merold Westphal, the philosopher, I love what he says as the way that we basically, and he was using Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche during the time of Lent to shed light on sin as a phenomena through the eyes of these non-Christian voices. And here's what he says. It's quite useful, actually. It's a great book. He says, perhaps we need to see Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, along with Luther and Barth, as expressing a Promethean protest against all the Zeuses of instrumental religion, the piety that reduces God to a means or instrument for achieving our own human purposes with professedly divine power and sanction. Because what Marx, what Nietzsche, what Freud them saw, there was a tendency, and this is true in history, of using religion as an instrument of state power or personal power or control or vanity. And we can do that in the church today, and many people do these things. But Jesus calls these things down and basically invites us to surrender, to give up our idols, to bow to Him. Why do I do what I do? Why do I not do what I should do? Why do I find it so easy to provide reasons for my lack of obedience in life? Again, drawing on what was called the hermeneutics of suspicion, Westphal describes this as the deliberate attempt to expose the self-deceptions involved in hiding our actual operative motives from ourselves, individually or collectively, in order not to notice how and how much our behavior and our beliefs are shaped by values we profess to disown. From British history, I think back of the story of the birth of what actually became the Anglican Church through Henry VIII. Henry VIII's appetite for women, his desire that he couldn't get divorces, so that basically as the king he took authority over the church, that way he could marry who he wanted and do what he wants. And that's the story of the human life. Yes, I want God, if I can have God in my terms. Yes, I want a Jesus who can be tamed and domesticated. Yes, I will follow a religion if it does what I want. But what if it calls me to obedience? What if it calls me to surrender? What if it calls me to take up my cross and follow Him? Sir Thomas More, the famous story of the man who was appointed by a profligate king to a place of power, but when he took the place of power, it was in the church, and then he began to see the calling he was given, and he took it seriously. Then he began to speak back to the king, and as a result ended up being executed. But he was then willing to faithful to bow to the true King of heaven and not bow to an earthly king. We get light from unexpected quarters on this. Why don't we obey? I think in our society we're dealing with a deep level of meaninglessness, of anarchy, and moral anarchy. There is something profoundly wrong, and one of the greatest sources of insight into what is wrong with us comes from one of the French existentialists, Albert Camus. In his book, The Rebel, he says this. Remember, this is not Christian. He's not writing Christian truth. He says, the rebel is a man who is on the point of accepting or rejecting the sacred and determined on laying claim to a human situation in which all the answers are human. In other words, formulated in reasonable terms. From this moment, every question, every word is an act of grace. Now he elaborates this. He says, it would be possible to demonstrate in this manner that only two possible worlds can exist for the human mind. The sacred, or to speak in Christian terms, the world of grace, and the world of rebellion. The disappearance of the one is equivalent to the appearance of the other, despite the fact that this appearance can take place in disconcerting forms. There would be too much time here to talk about Camus and the rebel and all that's involved in it. It's an excellent book, but he looks at the history of rebellion from all the way through, particularly the modern era, 19th and 20th century, the rise of the Nazis, the communist world, the 60s revolution, our desire to be free, and in our freedom constantly searching and never finding. We're back to Genesis again. Has God said? What will rule our lives? And I would suggest there's at least three possible responses in terms of thinking of obedience in our own lives. And maybe why some in the church just kind of wander all over the map. The first is unthinking drift. You live life on autopilot. You take it as it comes. There's no attention given to the serious things of grace. You don't really attend church. You don't take the sacraments. You're not listening to the word. You're not going to prayer meetings. You're not involved in evangelism. You're not giving. You're not worshiping. You're not really deep. And so you just drift through compromise and neglect. Or maybe it's unwilling attitude. You're like the guy in Matthew 20 when the son says, oh, yes, yes, I'll serve the church. I'll do this, I'll do that. The next thing you never do. You never show up. You never give. You never serve. But you've got the will and you want the sincerity. You love the appearance of outwardly looking the part, but never giving of your heart or your life or your resources. Or the third is resistance. I just don't want to. I don't care. I don't like it. I don't want it. Nothing for me. Too demanding. So what? Well, obedience is a choice. Obedience demands a commitment, and obedience follows a pattern of life. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, now for this very reason also, applying all diligence, he says, in your faith supply moral excellence, in your moral excellence, knowledge. In your knowledge, self-control. In your self-control, perseverance. In your perseverance, godliness. In your godliness, brotherly kindness. And in your brotherly kindness, love. If these qualities are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now this is a test here. It tells it very specifically. We're to apply all diligence, to have these qualities forming and shaping through us. But if they're not there, something is wrong. They're tests, they're measurements, they're things that we can actually look to as the fruit that we should expect in our life. So what do we do practically? Well, I think individually, we have to answer the question, what do I really want in life? Matthew 6:19 through 21 is a good picture where Jesus asked the question, where's your treasure? He says, where your treasure is, there is your heart. I can measure what I truly value by my time, my talents, my treasure. That's what I spend in. That's what I give time to. That's what's really important. Now I know what I really value because I give my time and my money to it. In Psalm 51, verse 10, David prayed, Lord, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. In John chapter 1, verse 4, it says, in him is life, and the life is the light of men. Maybe I haven't experienced that life. Maybe I haven't embraced that light. Maybe I haven't really been touched. Maybe it's just a concept. It's not a reality, and I need to surrender. But if this is going to be real, then I have to take the price seriously and do what the Scripture said. As a young Christian, I remember hearing these words, and I was challenged to this. And when I left Scotland in 1978, I was challenged to take up my cross and follow him. And it was on this passage from Luke chapter 9. And I remember I literally sold everything I had. I gave up the money I had at that time. I bought some things for the church, gave money to the mission, built a kitchen for my mother, and then left because I was told I could trust God for the rest. And I stepped out and I had nothing. Now here I am, a married man with 2 children, 2 grandchildren. I own my own home, a car. My kids have been through college, and I'm not boasting in anything, but all of that has been by grace through faith, and it's by being applying these words to reality. But in Luke chapter 9 and 23 through 26, Jesus makes this very clear. To those who were coming after him, he said, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake, he's the one who will save it. What is it a man profited if he gains the whole world and he loses or he forfeits himself? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. So there is a price to pay. Dallas Willard with Don Simpson said, when Jesus said we must lose our life to find it, he means we must give up the project of making ourselves and our survival the ultimate reference point in our world. Is that why so many people never go on to step 2 because they never take step 1? They say they believe in Jesus, but they've never denied self. And denying self is step 1. Again, Willard and Simpson. Spiritual formation rests on the indispensable foundation of death to self and cannot proceed unless that foundation is firmly laid and constantly sustained. Camus saw this even as a non-believer. Jesus was clear about that. The choice is specific, and the choice to us is Christ or culture. You're going to obey one of them. Which one are you obeying?